Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the launch of the Council's report on threat offences sentenced in Victoria. I'm Ari Freiberg, and I'm Chair of the Sentencing Advisory Council. And I'm joined today in giving this presentation by the project team who prepared this report, Anna Charlton, Senior Legal Policy Officer, and Dugan Dallimore, Data Analyst. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which the Council's office is located, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and future. We intend to keep this presentation relatively brief, so in the interest of time, we won't be holding a Q&A session, but please feel free to email Anna with any questions you may have. Her details will be provided to you on the last slide. We'll also be recording and uploading this presentation on YouTube a bit later on. Let's begin by looking at exactly what prompted the Council to investigate the sentencing of threat offences. Excuse me. First, we already know that they were an important factor for family violence. Secondly, each year, the Council releases a report on serious offences committed by people on a community correction order. And on each occasion, threats to kill and threats to inflict serious injury have been the two most common offences. Threat offences have also shown up in our reports on family violence intervention orders and their breaches, and on child and adult reoffending. It's also relatively uncommon to see threats being specifically researched, and a lot of the research that is available uses categories that combine threats to commit a crime with actually completing that crime. So what type of threat offences do we look at specifically? We looked at threats to kill or seriously injure and their Commonwealth equivalents, threats to destroy or damage property, threats to commit a sexual offence, and threats to injure an emergency worker. All of these threat offences carry maximum penalties of between 5 and 10 years imprisonment. Threats are an unusual offence because they can cause immediate harm, but they can also carry a risk of future harm. We've summarised the harms of threats as including the fear and psychological harm the threat directly causes, the effect of the threat on the victim's perceived freedom, and the risk of future harm. And the courts have recognised that threats can be made more serious by their context. For example, case law shows that threats are more serious when they're made in person, when they are explicit or premeditated, when they involve a breach of trust or the use of a weapon, when they have a severe effect on the victim, or when they're supported by circumstances that suggest the threat will actually be carried out. The courts are also especially aware of the specific harms that relate to threats made in a family violence context, especially those used to perpetuate what is known as coercive control. Courts have said that in these circumstances, the offender has breached the victim's trust when they should instead have been entitled to care, love, and security. This is especially true when the threat is made in the presence of children. In 2014, for example, the Court of Appeal said that offending of this nature is too often perpetrated by men whose response to difficulties in a relationship is one of possessive, violent rage. It goes without saying that such a response to what is a common human situation is utterly unacceptable. These sentences must convey the unmistakable message that male partners have no right to subject their female partners to threats of violence. And so it was in the context of the severe harms with threat offending, coupled with limited research on how those offences are sentenced, that the Council has sought to present Victoria's first comprehensive overview of the sentencing of threat offences. So on that note, I'll hand you over to the project team to take you through the key findings. Anna.
Thanks, Ari. We know that sentenced threat offences will only ever be the tip of the iceberg in terms of measuring the prevalence of threat offending. So before we get into the sentencing data, let's look at how many threat offences were recorded by police to get a higher level overview of threat offending in Victoria. In the 8 years from 2012 to 2019, the number of threat offences recorded by police increased by nearly 50%, from about 6,500 on the left to almost 10,000 on the right. Working our way up these columns, the big blue bars represent how many threats to kill were recorded by police. The yellow represents threats to inflict serious injury, the grey, threats to destroy or damage property. And then those last two small bars on top represent threats to assault an emergency worker or to commit a sexual offence. Since the beginning of this 8-year period, there are now over 1,300 more threats to kill each year, over 1,000 more threats to inflict serious injury, and the number of threats to damage property more than doubled from 400 to over 1,000. In those same years, the proportion of recorded offences that were linked to family violence increased. So, for example, 70% of recorded threats to kill, which is the light blue line at the top, were flagged as occurring in a family violence context in 2019. But in 2012, only 56% were. This was true for each of the 3 most common threat offences. A greater proportion are now family violence related, which suggests that the increase in threat offences recorded by police is largely attributable to an increase in police recording family violence related threats. Moving on to sentenced offence data now. This graph shows every threat charge that was sentenced between 2015 and 2019. As with threat offences recorded by police, we can see that the same 3 threat offences make up the majority. Threats to kill in blue at the bottom, then threats to inflict serious injury in yellow, and threats to damage property in grey. And the numbers are relatively stable, with between 3,500 and 4,000 threat offences sentenced each year. As we saw with recorded offences, more than half of these were linked to family violence. The highest proportion is for threats to destroy or damage property, where 2/3 of sentence charges were in cases with a family violence flag. And the highest absolute number is for threats to kill, at almost 5,000 of the nearly 8,000 total charges. As you might expect, threats to assault an emergency worker and threats to commit a sexual offence were not strongly linked to family violence. But there were relatively few of those offences sentenced in the 5-year period, just 59 charges of threats to commit a sexual offence. As with all violent offences, the majority of threat offenders were male, 88%, or over 12,000 of the 14,000 cases. Their threat offending also tends to be more serious. Males were more commonly sentenced for threat to kill. They more often made their threats in a family violence context. They were more often sentenced in the higher courts. They also had more substantial criminal histories and were more likely to receive a sentence of imprisonment. Most often, threat offenders were under 34 for both men and women. Over the next few slides, we're going to take a closer look at how these offences were sentenced in each jurisdiction: the Magistrates' Court, the higher courts, and the Children's Court. Starting with the Magistrates' Court. Imprisonment was the most common sentencing outcome overall, imposed for 35% of all charges. The first 5 columns here show you the sentence types imposed year by year. The final 6th column is the overall picture. It's not shown here, but the imprisonment rates by offence were highest for threats to commit a sexual offence or to assault an emergency worker, followed by threats to kill. As you can see, the rates of imprisonment, the blue bars at the bottom, increased during the study period. To a lesser extent, so did the rates of adjourned undertakings, in brown. Those are low-level community orders that can be imposed with or without recording a conviction. In contrast, the rates of community correction orders in yellow, and those are more serious community orders with more intensive conditions, fell over the study period. So there seems to be a decompression of sentencing outcomes, with sentencing outcomes becoming more and less severe over time. We asked our stakeholders why we might be seeing that increase in imprisonment sentences for threat offences in the Magistrates' Court. There was a consensus that it related to recent changes that have been made to bail legislation, which make it more difficult to get bail, especially in cases involving threats to kill in a family violence context. One stakeholder told us, "We find a lot more clients remanded. We're seeing a lot more clients in those circumstances receiving short imprisonment terms or receiving very low sentences to take into account the fact that they've served some time in custody." This is especially true for what's called time-served prison sentences. Those are where the offender has the time they spent on remand taken into account as them having already served their sentence. So technically, they receive a sentence of imprisonment, but practically, they're immediately released. We found that a quarter of all imprisonment sentences in threat cases were time-served sentences. That's slightly higher than the overall rate of time-served prison sentences in Victoria at 20%. The average prison sentence to each of the various threat offences in the Magistrates' Court was between 2 months and 4 months. This next graph shows us the sentence types imposed in family violence and non-family violence cases, where a threat offence was the most serious offence. The results are consistent with increasing recognition by courts that family violence-related cases should typically receive harsher sentences. The rate of imprisonment sentences in family violence threat cases was almost 30%, compared with less than 20% in non-family violence cases. Family violence cases were also more likely to receive community correction orders, which are the second most serious sentence in this graph. Given that we've seen an increase in family violence threat offending recorded by police and sentenced by courts, this could partly explain the increase in imprisonment sentences in the Magistrates' Court. I'll now hand you over to Dugan to take you through our findings in the higher courts and the Children's Court, as well as the other offences sentenced in threat cases across all courts.
Thanks, Anna. So when we say higher courts, we're talking about cases sentenced in either the County Court or the Supreme Court, the jurisdictions hearing the most serious 2% of criminal cases in Victoria. As you might expect, most of the threat offences dealt with in the higher courts were threats to kill, making up 377 of 521 threat offences, and more than 3/4 of threat offences received a term of imprisonment. The average term of imprisonment for a threat to kill charge in the higher courts was 14 months, and for a threat to inflict serious injury charge, it was 1 year. In the Children's Court, the most common sentence overall was probation, but the proportion of charges that resulted in probation dropped throughout the study period, and so did the number of charges sentenced. In contrast, the number of charges that resulted in youth diversion climbed from 7% to 29% of all sentencing outcomes. This is something we've been seeing across the board in the Children's Court over the last 6 years or so. The increased use of sentencing orders that are less likely to stigmatise and overburden children, which is intended to reduce reoffending rates. There was also an interesting trend in family violence cases in the Children's Court. Whereas adults whose offending occurs in a family violence context tend to receive more severe sentences, the opposite is true in the Children's Court. They tend to receive less severe sentences. That's probably because family violence in the Children's Court tends to occur in contexts where the child is primarily a victim rather than a perpetrator. And where the child is a perpetrator, that often occurs in a context where the child is very vulnerable, or the victim is a parent who doesn't want their child to receive a severe outcome and supports are available. Of course, many people sentenced for one offence are often sentenced for other offences in the same case. This graph shows how many charges were sentenced in each case during our 5-year period to 2019 across all courts. Those blue bars represent the total number of all offences in each case, while the yellow bar represents the total number of threat offences per case. What this tells us is that 3/4 of threat offenders only had the one threat offence in their case, but only 8% were sentenced for a single solitary threat offence. The other 92% had some other offence in the case as well. In fact, on average, there were 7.6 charges per case. That's affected a bit by case consolidations, especially in the Children's Court, but it still indicates that threat offenders are being sentenced for a lot of different offences, usually committed close together. So what were those other offences? This table shows us the top 5 other offences sentenced alongside threat charges, plus the rate of additional threats. They're ranked according to how common they are in the magistrate's court. The most common offences sentenced alongside threats were assaults, breaches of bail, breaches of family violence order, criminal damage, another threat, and theft. In other words, someone sentenced for a threat to hurt someone or damage property is reasonably likely to also be sentenced for actually hurting someone or damaging property. For instance, you can see at the top right that more than half of all children sentenced in the children's court for a threat offence were also sentenced for an assault offence. These are all common offences generally, and most are often associated both with either family violence or what's known as high criminogenic need offending. Offending associated with circumstances or needs that make people more likely to offend, such as homelessness, addiction, and neurodisability. This next table tells us similar information, except rather than telling us the most common offences sentenced alongside threats by court jurisdiction, it instead tells us the most common offences sentenced alongside threats by whether the case involved family violence or not. The key takeaway from this table is the much higher rate of co-sentenced offending in family violence threat cases, with almost half involving breaches of family violence orders and unlawful assaults, and about a third involving bail-related offences and criminal damage. I'll now hand you back to Anna to present the final few slides.
Thanks, Dugan. So one of the things we wanted to know was, where do threat offences sit in the life cycle of offending? This graph shows you how many threat offenders who were sentenced in 2015 and 2016, that's over 5,000 offenders, were also sentenced on another occasion in either the 3 years before or the 3 years after that sentence. So working our way from left to right, in the 3 years before their threat sentence, 52% of those offenders had been sentenced for other offending on at least one occasion. Looking at just the 12 months prior, the number was 28%. Then in the year after being sentenced for a threat offence, 32% of threat offenders were sentenced for other offending. And by 3 years after that sentence, that number climbed to 58%. I know that seems high, and it is. These green bubbles show the equivalent numbers for all offenders in Victoria from our last report on reoffending. So the 1 year reoffending rate for threat offences is more than triple the Victorian average, and the 3 year rate is more than double. These are exceptionally high reoffending rates. Those reoffending rates varied quite a bit for different groups of offenders. Female offenders had lower prior and subsequent offending rates than male offenders, for example, and children had much higher subsequent offending rates than adults, with 4 in 5 children sentenced for a threat offence sentenced again within the next 3 years. But in contrast, the prior and subsequent offending rates for family violence offenders were virtually the same as for non-family violence offenders. And the rates of subsequent violence didn't vary much between those two groups either. This was somewhat surprising to us. So we asked our stakeholders what they thought was happening here, and this is what they said. You've got two groups of reoffenders. One group is your family violence reoffenders, who are either reoffending within the same relationship or moving to a new relationship and reoffending. And you've got your group of poverty-related or high criminogenic need offending, who are reoffending in a very different context. And these two groups also overlapped. All right, last slide of data, we promise. This slide shows reoffending rates of threat offenders by whether they had prior sentences for non-violent offending in the previous 3 years. That's the middle column, as well as whether they had any prior violent offences in the previous 3 years. That's the column on the top. Working our way from the bottom to the top, we can see that 4 in 10 threat offenders without a recent criminal history were sentenced again within 3 years. That increases to 7 in 10 for those with a recent non-violent criminal history, and 8 in 10 for those with a violent recent criminal history. And there's a similar trend for violent reoffending. So only 17% of threat offenders without a recent criminal history were sentenced for violence within 3 years. But that almost triples to 47% for those with a recent violent criminal history. This is a common pattern in general. Prior violence can be a strong risk factor for future violence. But in the context of threats, we were interested in what it tells us about whether a threat is something that occurs before violence, or whether it's something that occurs alongside or after violence. And this information tells us that more often, the threat occurs as part of a pattern of offending that's already going on. So it's not necessarily that someone escalates from threatening violence to actually committing it. A lot of the time, they were already doing both. So with that in mind, it seems that threats don't necessarily indicate that someone is at risk of reoffending for the first time or of becoming violent for the first time. But they may be a sign that someone who is already offending, or perhaps already violent, is going to continue that behaviour unless something important changes. And that's very much consistent with both those groups we outlined, the family violence group and the criminogenic need group, which again, of course, aren't mutually exclusive groups. Indeed, threats seem to stand out as being especially associated with very high prior and reoffending rates, much more so than other offence types. Those offending rates represent a lot of social cost and pain. It's possible that using threat offending as a type of warning flag might help the justice system identify people who might continue offending because they have those underlying issues that we've been speaking about. Of course, it's not realistic to expect a single sentence alone to address these kinds of serious long-term issues. But perhaps a little more visibility over threat offences, especially in risk assessments, might allow us to better identify people who are going to keep offending. And that might enable some more targeting of services or interventions. Because with reoffending rates as high as these, even a moderate improvement could make a big difference. So that's it from us. We'd like to thank the courts and the Crime Statistics Agency for providing the data on which this report was based. We'd also like to thank the stakeholders who consulted with us on the findings. I encourage you all to download copies of the report from our website. There's also a 2-page fact sheet available, and those documents have all the findings we've talked about today and much more. Finally, we haven't included a Q&A component in today's session, but if you do have any questions arising from today's presentation, please feel free to get in contact. You can send an email to me using the email address here on the screen, and please do feel free to take a screenshot. Or you can get in contact through our website. Otherwise, thank you to everyone for taking time out of your day to attend today's session, and have a lovely afternoon.